Speciation. So before I get into the ins and outs of speciation, let's take a look at two different wolves. Both of these are native to North America. We have the eastern timber wolf on the left and the gray wolf. So I want you to look at these and ask yourself, what makes these two seemingly similar wolves different? What makes them similar? Maybe a better question would be, what makes these two very different looking animals the same species? But that's besides the point. So the issue of wolf species identification is a really hotly contested issue right now. We have these two wolf species here, and if you look at this light green area on the left, that's where you find the eastern wolf. And then on the right, we have the range of the gray wolf, historically before we came and annihilated them, and now they're just in these red patches. So we initially thought that these were different species, so they had totally different names. Now we consider them subspecies, and scientists are still arguing over whether or not the eastern wolf is the same as the gray wolf. Is it different than the gray wolf? So that brings the question, what exactly defines a species? So for the purposes of this class, we're going to define a species as a population whose members can interbreed and produce offspring that can reproduce. I highlighted that part because that is the key part of this definition. It's a population whose members interbreed and can produce offspring that can also have babies. If you can't make babies, not a species. Enter the liger, not just a middle school girl's fantasy animal, but it's actually a real-life hybrid mammal. So are ligers a species of their own? Sadly for the liger, they are not a species. And this is because although they can interbreed just fine, lions and tigers making all those ligers, the ligers themselves are not fertile and therefore can't reproduce. So, can't be their own species. We have lots of examples of this. We have the zorse, which is a zebra horse. We got a zonkey, the zebra donkey. We got a mule. Doesn't have a cool name, but it's a horse and a donkey. So through the course of this video, we're going to take a closer look at the process of speciation, or how new species develop. So a new species can develop when members of a species become reproductively isolated. So they can no longer interbreed. So this can happen for a variety of reasons that we'll get into momentarily. But over time, this separation leads to genetically different species. And we know that mutations randomly appear, so mutations will randomly appear differently in these two populations, eventually leading them to be so different they can no longer reproduce. So I want you to take a moment and just imagine a parrot. Like, really picture it. Where does this parrot live? What does it look like? What does it eat? Are these the parrots you thought of? Is this where that parrot lived? Do they eat fruits, nuts, seeds? That's what I would expect. But let me introduce you to my favorite parrot. It's a terrible picture of my favorite parrot. This is the Kia. So obviously, this is a pretty drab-looking parrot, but there must be something really fantastic about it in order for this boring bird to be my most favorite parrot, because that's just how I roll. So let's find out. So this is the Kia. The Kia is found only on the South Island of New Zealand. That's kind of interesting, I guess. But what makes them really interesting is they are the only species of alpine parrot, meaning they hang out in cold areas with lots of snow. They like to hang out at ski resorts high up in the mountains. So I think that's kind of like a mildly interesting fact. But for this to be my favorite animal, there's gotta be something better about it. So let's see. Ah, look, They aren't even that dull. They're actually really neat looking when they're flying. But that's not the cool part either. One of my favorite facts about them is they are highly intelligent and they are incredibly big jerks to people. They're considered to be most likely the most intelligent bird there is. They can solve complex problems. They can figure out probabilities of events happening, and they will rip apart your car and steal your stuff. It doesn't get any better than that. Or does it? So just like all the other average parrots out there, it eats seeds and nuts and fruits and dead animals and sheep. I mean, well, that's not for normal parrots, but my favorite part is they are the only carnivorous parrot. They will even eat sheep while they're still alive. Now, if that doesn't make this bird your favorite, I don't know if we can talk anymore. So these guys had to evolve a different strategy to deal with the cold alpine temperatures, and their strategy, eat meat. So you may be wondering, how on earth could we get a meat-eating, snow-loving parrot? Enter Pangaea. Perhaps you've seen this before. This was our supercontinent when everybody was one big giant continent. I have an arrow pointing at where New Zealand comes from. Later, you may not be as familiar with Laurasia and Gondwana. These were when the continent of Pangaea split into two. You can see I am pointing at where New Zealand comes from. And that is the moment when we get my favorite birds. So, this is a zoomed in picture of New Zealand. There are 8 remaining endemic parrot species in New Zealand. Endemic meaning they only exist in New Zealand. That's how crazy they are. So there's some other ones that are kind of boring, but let me tell you about my 2 favorites. Of course, I have to have more than one favorite. So the kea I already told you about, alpine, cold-loving, carnivorous parrot. But let me tell you about the kakapo. So originally there was no predatory mammals on New Zealand. It was a pretty happy place to be a bird. So they developed all kinds of interesting strategies. The kakapo is the equivalent of a green, fluffy, chubby penguin. They are the fattest parrot. They are totally flightless, and they are nocturnal. Why am I bringing this up? Because they are a perfect example of allopatric speciation. That's a mouthful. So we have our population of birds, that's our white circle. Eventually, some sort of geographic barrier arises that causes the 2 populations to be physically separated so that they develop into 2 individual populations. In our case, for the kea and the kakapo, they were physically separated from the rest of the parrot population when the continents broke up and they got put on a little island. Well, everybody else was on the other continents. So the physical separation means they can no longer interbreed, and then due to things like mutations, genetic drift, inbreeding, we get completely different populations that no longer might even represent, look similar to each other. That's what I'm trying to say. We also can get new species from sympatric speciation. So this one's a little bit stranger because there's no physical barrier present. There's just something that causes a small set of the original population to become different to a point where they no longer interbreed. So they still live in the same area, they just are no longer the same species. So let me give you an example. Everybody loves maggots, so we'll talk about the hawthorn maggot fly. So originally, the hawthorn maggot fly was one species that just laid its eggs in a hawthorn tree, and it was a happy hawthorn maggot fly, except for it doesn't like its name. Then we imported apples to the United States, and some of the hawthorn maggot flies said, hey, cool, I'm going to lay my eggs over on the apples, and then they just kept doing that because it was working for them. So over time, although they live in the same area, we now have 2 species, the hawthorn maggot fly, which still lays its eggs on the hawthorn, and the apple, that's not how you spell apple, The apple maggot fly, I'm not going to fix that right now. The apple maggot fly only lays its eggs on an apple. So, same area, 2 species, used to be 1 species. So that comes back to the wolf problem. Same species, different species. It kind of looks like it could be that sympatric speciation, but they might still be interbreeding. Science may never know.